You need to watch this if you crave chills down your spine. Welcome to Soul Studios. Here, true crime meets the unknown. Suspense lurks in every shadow, and supernatural forces whisper from the dark. We craft chilling, edge-of-your-seat short stories inspired by the eerie, the unexplained, and the most haunting mysteries. 3 new stories drop every week, each one darker than the last. Are you ready to step inside? Subscribe now before the next story finds you.
In 2025, the world thinks the Cold War ended decades ago. But what if every headline was hiding something far more terrifying? Tonight, a dying US intelligence official breaks a lifetime of silence to reveal the greatest secret of the 20th century. He spent his career in the shadows of top-secret programs, guarding a truth so monstrous that exposing it could upend everything you thought you knew. In just 60 seconds, you'll hear why Roswell was never science fiction, how the space race masked an urgent military buildup, and why every major crisis might have been part of a single, hidden war, one we still haven't won. No spoilers, just the pulse-racing setup for a story that redefines history and stares straight into the abyss. If you crave true-style conspiracies, slow-burn horror, and secrets that leave you looking over your shoulder, subscribe now to Soul Studios and turn on notifications. Because the next time you see something strange in the sky, it might be real. I never imagined my life would end like this, in a small, dimly lit hospital room, surrounded by the incessant beeping of monitors and the sterile scent of antiseptic. At 84 years old, my body is failing me. Each rattling breath could be my last. But it's not the manner of my death that preoccupies me. It's the secret I've carried for decades. A secret that now, in these final hours of 2025, demands to be told. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what I know and what I've done. For a lifetime, I was a loyal servant to my country, a top-secret US official buried deep in the shadows of government. I raised my right hand, took oaths of silence, and lied to everyone I ever loved, all to protect one monstrous truth. Everything you think you know about the Cold War is a lie. The truth is that the Cold War, all those years of tension, the nuclear arms race, the proxy wars, the paranoia, it was never truly about communism versus capitalism, East versus West. It was a cover story, an elaborate decades-long ruse cloaked in patriotic fervor and ideological bluster. An entire era of global fear and division was orchestrated as part of a single, terrifying mission that almost no one knew about. We called it Operation Iron Veil. I was part of that operation from the very beginning of my career. As I lie here on my deathbed, memories flood back, some crystal clear, others warped by time and guilt. I remember the faces of men and women who entrusted me with their lives. The classified documents stamped in red, top secret majestic across the header. The late-night emergency calls that made my heart pound with dread. Operation Iron Veil was the shield we held up to the world, an iron curtain of deception meant to hide the approach of something far more dangerous than any human adversary. Before I leave this world, I must confess what we really were fighting all those years. I owe it to whoever will listen, to you, to finally pull aside the Iron Veil. I pray that in doing so, I can find a shred of absolution for the part I played in keeping this horrible truth from the world. Let me take you back to where it all began, to the first whispers of the secret war that shaped our world and the impending horror that even now draws near. I grew up in the dawn of the Cold War, when the world was just learning to fear the bomb and the Red Menace. But one hot July day in 1947, something happened that made people whisper about a very different kind of menace. I was only a boy, but I remember the adults huddled around the radio in our living room, the static crackling as a news announcer excitedly reported that the army had captured Flying Disc out in the New Mexico desert. Roswell, they called it. My father shook his head in disbelief, and my mother muttered that it must be some war jitters or a hoax. By the next day, the papers said it was just a weather balloon after all. The incident faded from headlines as quickly as it had appeared. What does a 6-year-old understand of such things? At the time, very little. I went on chasing grasshoppers and reading comic books, blissfully unaware that anything had happened. The world moved on. The Cold War deepened. Yet in secret, Roswell was an alarm bell that set Operation Iron Veil into motion long before it even had a name. I wouldn't learn this until many years later, but that alleged weather balloon crash was the first shot in a war most people didn't even know we were fighting. Fast forward to the late 1950s. I'm a young Air Force intelligence officer, freshly minted and eager. I had no idea what I was stepping into. One of my early assignments brought me to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, to a dusty archives room beneath an old hangar. I was tasked with inventorying classified files from defunct projects. It sounded boring, flipping through old reports about experimental aircraft and missile tests. But in those files, behind a heavy cabinet, I found a slim manila folder that didn't match the others. Its pages were yellowed, edges worn by curious fingers. On the tab, it read, 1947 Roswell, Incident Report. My heart pounded as I eased the folder open. Inside were black and white photographs, grainy but clear enough to make me gasp. Wreckage strewn across a desert floor, not the tattered remains of any weather balloon or known aircraft, but metallic debris etched with strange symbols. In one photo, a group of men in Army Air Force uniforms stood around something on a tarp. I squinted, bringing it inches from my face. Lying on that tarp were bodies, small, pale forms with large heads and vacant, inky eyes. They looked like mannequins or dolls, but something in my gut told me they were not. There were typed reports as well, with terse descriptions. Recovered craft of unknown origin, biological specimens, approx were 4 feet tall, transport to Wright Field, Hangar 18 for analysis. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise with each word I read. There was an otherworldly coldness in those accounts, the way the officers struggled to describe things for which there were no words yet. One line stood out, burned into my memory. Item 12, fragment, hull material, exhibits properties of extreme tensile strength, light weight, composition unknown to science. This was not Soviet, not any earthly technology we knew. I must have made a noise, a sharp intake of breath, a curse under my breath, because before I knew it, a heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder. I spun around to see a colonel glaring at me. I'll never forget his steely eyes as he snapped the folder shut in my hands. "Son, you've seen enough," he growled. "This never leaves this room, understood?" I was speechless, still processing the impossible images I'd just seen. I managed to nod. The colonel's voice lowered to a deadly whisper. "If you value your career and your life, forget Roswell. Now, that was my baptism into the true Cold War. In that moment, I realized there was a shadow conflict running beneath the one the world knew about. Roswell wasn't a myth. It was the opening salvo. And the enemy, as incredible as it seemed, wasn't Russian at all. It wasn't even human. I wasn't punished for peeking at Roswell. Not exactly. Instead, that moment marked a turning point in my life. A few days after the colonel caught me with that file, I was approached by 2 men in dark suits, no names given. They escorted me to an interview room where a panel of stern-faced officials waited. I remember the smoke from someone's cigarette curling in the projector light as they showed me grainy footage of disc-shaped craft darting across skies, of uniformed men recovering strange metallic fragments from fields. They played crackling audio recordings of fighter pilots shouting in astonishment, "It's not one of ours! It's not one of ours!" followed by screams and static. My hands trembled on the table as I realized the Roswell file was just the beginning. That day, I was read into Operation Iron Veil, though it didn't have that name officially yet. To them, it was just a nameless top-secret initiative to address an existential threat. The men spelled it out in plain English. Unidentified flying objects are real, they are intelligently controlled, and they are not from any nation on Earth. I felt a chill colder than any winter as those words sank in. I was being asked to join a war hidden in plain sight. Without hesitation, I swore the oath. I was 19 and foolish. I thought I was being handed the keys to some grand adventure. In the 1950s, while ordinary Americans built bomb shelters and school children learned to duck and cover under their desks, A handful of us were preoccupied with a threat that made nuclear war seem almost tame. The sightings of unknown craft were multiplying. They appeared as silvery daylight discs or nocturnal lights that danced and zigzagged beyond the capabilities of any jet. We pored over reports of Foo Fighters from WOE-2 pilots, of mysterious green fireballs streaking over the deserts near Los Alamos, where we tested our first atomic bombs. Every time we set off a nuclear test, we noticed an uptick in strange activity, as if something out there was listening and watching us toy with the fire of creation. We created official programs to investigate, at least in appearance. The Air Force's Project Blue Book was launched to catalogue UFO sightings, ostensibly to determine if they were a threat. I worked briefly with Blue Book analysts, reviewing civilian reports that poured in by the thousands. But it was all smoke and mirrors for the public. Behind closed doors, we already knew the answer. A threat was here, lurking in our skies. Blue Book's public conclusions always found conventional explanations: weather balloons, swamp gas, mass hysteria. Privately, our experts were alarmed at how advanced these objects were. I remember one night in 1952, I was on duty at the Pentagon when the phones lit up like Christmas. Unidentified radar blips had been spotted right over Washington, D.C., multiple bogies gliding over the National Mall, even the White House. Air Force jets roared into the sky to intercept, but each time they approached, the glowing orbs vanished at impossible speed, only to reappear elsewhere minutes later. For 2 nerve-wracking nights, the nation's capital was a playground for these intruders. The press got wind of it. Headlines screamed about flying saucers outrunning our fastest fighters right over our cities. The public was jittery. President Truman demanded answers. All we could do was stammer about temperature inversions causing radar ghosts, a lie, of course. In truth, those of us watching the scopes in that darkened command center knew we were virtually defenseless against whatever those things were. That Washington incident was a wake-up call. Not just for Americans. The Soviets knew about it too, through their spies, and they were just as spooked. Shortly after, a secret meeting of top scientists and intelligence officials, a group rumored to be called Majestic 12, concluded that we had to clamp down on public knowledge of this phenomenon. The logic was chilling yet simple. If the public panicked or adversaries misunderstood these sightings, it could trigger catastrophe. The Cold War provided a perfect distraction. We let people think every strange light in the sky was either a Soviet prototype or a misidentified airplane. Meanwhile, under the iron veil of secrecy, we and the Soviets both started preparing for a very different kind of war. Radar networks were expanded across North America and Europe, officially to detect Soviet bombers, but we all knew the data was also feeding into our alien tracking systems. We built the sprawling NORAD command center deep under Cheyenne Mountain, Colorado, in 1958. On the surface, it was to guard against a nuclear first strike, but deep in its encrypted databanks were records of objects that streaked in from above the atmosphere, not from across the pole. I visited Cheyenne Mountain in its early days. Rows of humming computers and map displays, the air thick with cold recycled air. On one screen was a list labelled uncorrelated targets. That was our euphemism for UFOs that could not be explained. There were dozens each month. Dozens. Everyone was logged, investigated quietly, and then swept under the rug of official silence. By the end of the 1950s, we knew one thing for sure. We were not alone, and the visitors were not benign observers. They were testing our defenses, probing at our world the way a wolf prowls outside a barn. And so we steeled ourselves. The public thought the enemy was the Soviet Union, that the darkest threat was a mushroom cloud. But those of us involved in Operation Iron Veil knew another truth. The real enemy was lurking in the stars and skies, and our secret war to resist them had only just begun. Then came the Cuban Missile Crisis, October 1962. The world held its breath as the US and the Soviet Union inched toward nuclear annihilation over missiles in Cuba. I was a young intelligence officer, newly assigned to a high-security coordination center in Washington. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and fear. We were at DEFCON 2, one step from all-out war. But amid the tension between Kennedy and Khrushchev, something else was unfolding behind the scenes. It was the evening of October 25th. I was hunched over a radar console, headset on, listening to the steady ping of our scopes, watching for Soviet bombers or missiles. Suddenly, an alarm blared and a red blip streaked across my screen. Unidentified fast mover. It was coming in over the Atlantic, headed toward the east coast. Fast, faster than any aircraft we knew. My commander barked orders, and within minutes, we had scrambled a jet interceptor from New Jersey, a pilot flying an F-106 armed with a nuclear-tipped Genie missile. Tension in the bunker was suffocating. This could be the start of World War III, for all we knew. Our pilot's voice crackled over the radio. He had a lock on the bogey high above New York, but the target was at 75,000 feet and still climbing, moving at Mach 3, then Mach 5. Eyes widened around the room. No Soviet plane or missile could do that. The president was notified. I heard the urgency in the brass's voices as they tried to figure out what to tell him. On my scope, the unidentified object suddenly changed course with a sharp turn that should have been impossible, evading our interceptor. It streaked northward, and within seconds it vanished off our screens, shooting into Canadian airspace and beyond. We later found out the Soviets were seeing the same blip on their radars and were equally bewildered. For a brief moment, both superpowers faced a common unknown in the skies. In the midst of humanity's most dangerous standoff, they showed up, as if to remind us how utterly outmatched we really were. I remember standing there in that war room, the fluorescent lights glaring down at maps of Cuba and the US, and realizing the irony. While we were ready to annihilate each other, an even greater threat was toying with us, one that wanted us to teeter on the brink of destruction. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended with a fragile peace. The Soviets pulled their nukes from Cuba. We quietly removed ours from Turkey. The public sighed with relief, thinking wise leadership had saved the day. But those of us in Operation Iron Veil knew another factor had weighed on the minds of Kennedy and Khrushchev. In secret communications, our leaders exchanged more than threats. They shared fear about the unexplained craft that almost lit the powder keg. It's whispered that this was when both sides tacitly agreed. If something truly out of this world intervened, we would not hastily blame each other. A direct hotline was set up between Washington and Moscow after the crisis, officially to prevent accidental nuclear war, but unofficially it served another purpose too. On more than one occasion, that hotline was used to confirm, no, it's not us, it's them, when bright objects streaked over our skies. The close call in October '62 only redoubled our efforts. We threw ourselves into building better radar, faster interceptors, anything to give us a chance. At ultra-secret facilities like Area 51 in Nevada, our brightest engineers worked day and night. Area 51 was more than a test site for spy planes. It was where we ferried captured alien hardware for study. I made a trip there in 1964, flown in on a windowless C-130 under cover of darkness. Inside a cavernous hangar sat a craft unlike any conventional aircraft, a curved disc partially covered by tarps. Even shielded, it emitted a low hum that made my teeth ache. In adjacent labs, metallurgists and physicists poked and prodded at fragments recovered from various incidents. I saw a piece of alloy from Roswell, no larger than a coin, that levitated slightly above the table and shifted color when you brought a magnet near it. We knew we were woefully outclassed by the technology we faced. Still, we salvaged what we could. Some say advances like integrated circuits and fiber optics in the late 20th century came from these studies, small gifts from fallen stars we desperately repurposed for our own use. If we couldn't equal their power, maybe we could at least steal a spark of it. Despite these breakthroughs, an unsettling truth was apparent. If they chose to attack openly, we might not be able to stop them. The Cuban scare proved we could barely even touch one fast-moving craft. And worse, it showed how easily our itchy trigger fingers could be manipulated. I often wondered, lying awake at night, did they stage that flyover deliberately to see if we'd nuke ourselves in panic? The thought made my blood run cold. We had stared down the Soviets, yes, but we'd also glimpsed the true enemy lurking behind the curtain. And after October 1962, there was no turning back. The secret war had entered a new, more dangerous phase. The mid-1960s brought a frantic race to space. On the surface, the United States and Soviet Union competed to prove technological superiority by launching satellites, cosmonauts, and astronauts into the void. But behind that patriotic fervor lay another motive. Both superpowers knew that getting into orbit and beyond might be crucial if an extraterrestrial threat materialized. Space was the new high ground, and we couldn't let them have it uncontested. NASA was founded, missions Mercury and Gemini blazed the trail, and soon Apollo aimed for the moon. I was by then liaising between the military and intelligence services on one side and NASA on the other, ensuring that any unexplainable sightings by astronauts were filtered before public release. And there were sightings. Astronauts, military test pilots, the best eyes we had, reported objects pacing their spacecraft, bright flashes on the lunar horizon, or strange transmissions that shouldn't have been there. Most of these reports were buried in debrief files or explained away as space junk or solar flares, but privately they unnerved us. In July 1969, when Apollo 11 finally landed on the moon, the world was elated. I was too, but I also held my breath. There were contingency plans for everything, even for encountering alien life. During the moonwalk, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin spoke on a public channel describing the barren lunar surface. But on a secure channel, one not heard by the world, there were whispers that something was watching them. Later, in a closed debrief, Armstrong allegedly confessed to seeing lights or crafts perched on a distant crater edge, like they're here, watching us. We made sure such transcripts never saw daylight. Whether it was a hallucination or the real thing, the mere possibility could have derailed the whole Apollo program. As humanity took its first steps into space, Project Blue Book, the Air Force's public UFO inquiry, was terminated in 1969. Officially, Blue Book declared there was nothing to worry about, that UFOs posed no threat. It was a convenient conclusion delivered to a public distracted by the triumph of Apollo and the turmoil of Vietnam. I remember reading the final Blue Book report, a thick stack of papers full of statistics and case dismissals, and laughing bitterly. No threat to national security, it said. Perhaps no human agency's security, indeed. We in Operation Iron Veil knew better. Blue Book's shutdown just meant our work would continue in total secrecy, with no risk of pesky public oversight. Meanwhile, the phenomena did not slow down. If anything, the late 60s saw the invaders grow bolder. In 1967, at the height of the Vietnam War, an incident on American soil sent chills through the Pentagon. At a remote ICBM launch complex in Montana, our nuclear missiles shut down one by one, just went dead, offline, inexplicably. At the same time, security personnel topside were frantically reporting a bright, pulsing red saucer hovering over the facility's gate. I saw the classified report. Guards described a blinding beam of light shooting into the concrete silo doors, and then all the control panels went dark. Our most powerful weapons had been neutralized in seconds. The Air Force chalked it up to an electrical malfunction to cover the truth. But those of us who read the report understood it was a clear message from them. They were telling us your mightiest weapons mean nothing to us. We control whether you live or die. This was the terrifying backdrop as the 1960s came to an end. We had touched the moon, yet on our own Earth, we were at the mercy of intruders who could appear and vanish at will, who could silence our nukes like flicking off a light switch. So we pressed on even harder. Secret research bases like Area 51 and others deep underground in places like Wright-Patterson churned away, analyzing alien tech, seeking any advantage. The space race wasn't just a point of pride. It was a desperate grab for any strategic edge beyond our atmosphere. We even launched satellites specifically to look for them. High-powered infrared eyes in the sky to catch the telltale heat signatures of fast-moving craft outside Earth's atmosphere. A few times we detected things, fleeting hotspots zipping through space near our satellites, but we could never get good data before they were gone. By the end of the 60s, I was exhausted and haunted. The world celebrated peace as the US and USSR began to pursue détente, easing tensions just a little. But I had seen behind the curtain. I knew that even as the Cold War smiled for the cameras, Operation Iron Veil's secret war was escalating. We had spent the decade racing each other to the moon, only to realize the real race was against those silently preparing above and among us. and the finish line was nowhere in sight. By the early 1970s, a strange lull settled over the geopolitical world. The Vietnam War was winding down, the US and USSR entered a period of détente, and people dared to hope the worst was behind us. But in the shadows, our clandestine war against the alien encroachment only deepened. With the public less panicked about nukes, we quietly redirected resources to unorthodox research and international cooperation against the real threat. In 1971, a little-known agreement was signed between Washington and Moscow, the Measures for the Prevention of Nuclear War. Buried in its text was a clause that each side would notify the other immediately of any unexplained phenomena that might be mistaken for a nuclear attack. The world assumed this was just to prevent false alarms caused by flocks of geese or computer glitches. But we on the inside understood the truth. It was an acknowledgement of them. Too many times had a UFO almost triggered World War III. We had nearly destroyed ourselves in 1962 because of such an encounter. Both superpowers now implicitly agreed. When the unearthly showed up, we would whisper to each other, "Not me, perhaps them," and stay our fingers from the button. This spirit of hushed cooperation extended further. Through back channels and cutouts, American and Soviet scientists started to share data on UFO sightings and recoveries. I was part of a secret delegation in 1973 that met with Soviet counterparts in a safe house in Geneva. We were deadly enemies by day, but that night we spoke the same language of fear. The Soviet officers traded tales of glowing orbs haunting their remote missile bases in Siberia, just as we shared our own nightmares. We even exchanged a few physical fragments. They handed us a sliver of metal from a crash on the Yenisei River, and we gave them a printout of microwave frequencies we'd recorded during an encounter over Alaska. It was an uneasy alliance, born not of trust but of mutual terror. Meanwhile, we pushed the boundaries of science and morality to prepare for what might come. The CIA's infamous MK-Ultra program, dosing unwitting subjects with LSD and experimenting with mind control, had another secret goal. Among the often gruesome psychological tests, a subset was aimed at exploring psychic phenomena and altered states, hoping to find people who could sense the aliens or even communicate with them. We had heard rumors that the visitors might have telepathic abilities. If we could develop human telepaths or mind defenses, it might be the difference between resistance and enslavement. I sat behind one-way glass in 1975 as a volunteer, eyes wide from an LSD cocktail, described in a monotone voice a tall figure with black eyes standing in the corner of the room. There was no one there, at least none of us could see. The man began screaming and clawing at his own eyes until we sedated him. I'll never forget the way he later described it. He was in my head. It knows my name. We shut that part of the program down, officially. Unofficially, we funneled it into a new project, Stargate, the Pentagon's effort to train remote viewers to psychically spy on targets. Some of those targets were Soviet bases, but some were places we thought they might be lurking. If even a fraction of those experiments succeeded, it meant the war for Earth could be fought in the realm of minds and perceptions, not just with guns and rockets. During this time, unsettling reports among civilians also began to spike. We had always had a trickle of weird stories. Someone sees a flying saucer or claims to meet a being in the woods. But in the 1970s, it turned into a flood of horror we could barely contain. People from all over the country and the world started reporting missing time, lost hours of their lives. A farmer in Indiana woke up at dawn in his truck, engine running, with 2 hours unaccounted for and burns on the back of his neck. A couple driving along a New England back road experienced a blinding light and later found strange triangular marks on their skin. These tales of abductions were dismissed as delusions or fodder for sci-fi movies, but we quietly compiled them. I read dozens of transcripts of hypnotic regressions where ordinary folks recalled nightmarish encounters, being paralyzed on cold metal tables, staring up into huge black eyes, feeling probes and needles, hearing voices in their head gently saying, "Don't be afraid," even as they were terrified. We cross-referenced these with radar logs and found, more often than not, there were indeed anomalous aerial objects in those areas at those times. Piece by piece, a dreadful picture was forming. The invaders weren't just studying us from afar, they were here, in our homes and backyards, taking whoever they pleased for God knows what experiments. And it wasn't only humans. Ranchers in the American West began finding their cattle dead in fields, strangely mutilated. I personally flew to a site in Colorado in 1978, posing as a Department of Agriculture rep. The sight and smell of that cow still haunts me. Its corpse was drained of blood, organs cleanly excised with laser-like precision. No predators, no footprints. Local authorities shrugged it off as cult activity, but our team's sensors picked up trace radiation and electromagnetic readings around the carcass, the kind you might get from a hovering craft. We collected samples under the hush of night. Back at the lab, the tissue showed signs of rapid cauterization, as if cut by an extremely high-energy device. We had seen similar before in other mutilation cases. The conclusion was chilling. The invaders were harvesting living creatures, perhaps researching our biology. Practicing on animals, perhaps with an eye toward doing the same to us on a larger scale. By the late 70s, I felt the weight of the secret war crushing me. The worst part was having to smile and pretend everything was fine in front of friends and family. I remember attending a 4th of July barbecue in 1976. As the neighborhood celebrated America's bicentennial, I stood there with a hot dog in hand, looking up at the fireworks bursting in the night sky. Every clap of thunderous spark made me flinch, thinking of incoming crafts or energy weapons. My wife noticed my hands shaking. I told her I was just remembering mortar fire from my brief tour in Korea, a lie to cover a lie. If only she knew. The truth was, I was imagining what it would be like when those lights in the sky weren't fireworks or rockets of celebration, but the opening salvos of an alien assault. I lost pieces of myself in the 1970s. My marriage fell apart under the strain of secrets and my constant bottled-up dread. A couple of my colleagues couldn't take it. One ate his service pistol in a lonely motel. Another just vanished, rumoured to have defected or been taken care of after he threatened to leak what he knew. We were all haunted, paranoid. We triple-checked the locks on our doors at night. Some of us even wondered if they had infiltrated us. How easily could they mimic human form or influence human minds? Sometimes we saw communists or capitalists under the bed when it was really just our own fear. But there were a few incidents that defied any normal explanation, where key figures suddenly behaved out of character, as if possessed. We kept those files secret, even from many Iron Veil members. Maybe it was paranoia, maybe not. After everything I'd seen, nothing seemed completely impossible anymore. So we lived with the darkness, and we fought on in silence. Each day's mundane normalcy for the public was, for us, a fragile stage set in front of a looming abyss. The Cold War's battles played out in proxy conflicts and diplomatic chess, but Operation Iron Veil's battle was one of data, secrets and lies, all to keep humanity blissfully ignorant and incrementally safer, we hoped, from the horrors circling above. The 1970s ended with no grand invasion, no revelation, but we all felt it was only the calm before a greater storm. If the 70s were a quiet dread, the 1980s felt like standing on a razor's edge. Technology was leaping forward, computers, satellites, stealth aircraft, and we harnessed it all for Operation Iron Veil. At the same time, the invaders' activities became bolder, almost brazen. It was as if they knew our defenses were improving and wanted to remind us we were still helpless. One chilling incident came in late 1982. Deep inside the Soviet Union, at a missile base near the Ural Mountains, something extraordinary and terrifying occurred. I saw the after-action report through our intelligence channels. In the dead of night, base personnel observed a cluster of lights maneuvering above their nuclear warhead storage. Suddenly, the base's launch systems inexplicably went into countdown, as if someone had activated them to fire missiles at the United States. For agonizing minutes, the Soviets nearly scrambled to retaliate, thinking an attack was underway. Then, just as mysteriously, the countdown aborted. The lights in the sky shot off into the stars. Later, when the Soviets inspected their systems, they found no malfunction that could account for it. It was as if their fingers had been on our nuclear trigger. We got word of this incident through a back channel. I remember reading the translation of the Soviet general's message. They interfered with our devil's toys. Both Washington and Moscow shuddered. The invaders had demonstrated they could start our doomsday engines for us, play us against each other like pawns. President Ronald Reagan took this threat seriously, more than perhaps any leader before him. Reagan had a folksy, optimistic demeanor in public, but in private briefings he was shown the darker reality. I know, because I helped prepare some of those briefings in 1981 when he took office. He was shocked by the photos and footage, a man who grew up in the golden age of sci-fi B-movies, now learning it was all real. His response was to ramp up our defenses in space. This was the genesis of the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, mockingly nicknamed Star Wars. The public assumed it was all about missile shields to stop Soviet ICBMs. In truth, parts of SDI research dove into exotic weapons, laser cannons, particle beams, things straight out of science fiction, because we hoped to have something, anything, that could knock a UFO out of the sky. I sat in one meeting where a general straight up asked a Lockheed scientist, "Could your system shoot down a flying saucer at 100,000 feet going Mach 10? The scientist chuckled nervously, but Reagan didn't bat an eye. He wanted an answer. We poured billions into these concepts. Some of them quietly got tested. Rumor has it by mid-decade we managed to damage a small craft off the California coast with an airborne laser. It limped away into the atmosphere before we lost track of it. Shortly after, a wave of unexplained forest fires and power blackouts hit that region, perhaps retaliation, perhaps coincidence. Either way, we had made it clear we were no longer content to just observe. We were gearing up for a fight. Reagan, to his credit, also tried to prepare the public's mind in subtle ways. In 1987, he stood before the United Nations and mused aloud how quickly our differences would vanish if mankind faced an alien threat from outside this world. I was in that assembly hall, part of the US delegation, and those of us who knew the truth exchanged quiet, knowing glances. The delegates laughed nervously, as if it were just a fanciful metaphor. But I could see in Reagan's eyes that he meant every word. He had seen things that would make any human beg for unity. A few months later, Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, revealed that Reagan had privately urged cooperation on the alien issue. Gorbachev even admitted that in a Geneva summit in '85, Reagan pressed him. If we faced an extraterrestrial invasion, would the USSR stand with the US? According to Gorbachev, he replied, "Da, конечно." Yes, of course. When I heard that anecdote, I felt a shiver of hope. Perhaps, I thought, if our bitterest rivals could find common cause in the face of the unknown, there was a chance for humanity after all. Hope, however, was tempered by ever-growing fear. In 1986, I had one of the most harrowing experiences of my career. That year, something crashed in the mountains of Peru, and Operation Iron Veil mobilized a covert recovery team. By then, I was high-ranking enough to oversee parts of the operation, so I flew to a forward base where they brought the debris. What came out of those mountains changed everything for me. Amid twisted metal that seemed to shimmer with its own light, there was a body. It was the first time I saw one of them with my own eyes, not in photos. The being lay motionless on a stretcher under floodlights, about 5 feet tall, slender, with greyish mottled skin. Its head was large, bulbous at the top with a tapering chin, and those eyes, dear God, those eyes were black mirrors, open and staring even in death. Some of the younger soldiers present crossed themselves or whispered prayers. One man vomited in the bushes. As for me, I felt transfixed by that corpse, a mix of revulsion and sorrow and terror swirling in my heart. We didn't have it for long. Less than 2 days after it was retrieved, everything, the wreckage, the body, even the soldiers who knew, was transferred to a secure US facility. I got only scraps of information afterward. A friend in the lab told me the autopsy yielded baffling results. The creature's organs were like a tangle of biotech, part organic, part integrated circuitry, as if it was grown and engineered simultaneously. Before more could be learned, the specimens were whisked away to some ultra-secret location, perhaps Wright Pat or Area 51 again, I'm not sure. That was above my clearance, but I do know one disturbing detail. Our recovery team reported that there had been 2 life forms at the crash site. One was dead, the one I saw. The other was missing, presumed to have survived and escaped. Tracks led into the dense jungle and simply vanished. For months after, I barely slept, imagining that lone survivor slithering through the dark, maybe even killing and impersonating one of our team. The paranoia of potential infiltration skyrocketed. We quietly screened the personnel who were there for any signs of abnormal behavior. Everyone checked out, except one sergeant, who disappeared on leave a month later and was never found. Coincidence? Or the escaped alien silencing a witness? The truth is, we had no idea. The enemy no longer felt entirely out there in the stars. It might be among us, wearing familiar faces. By the late 80s, an undercurrent of fatalism settled on me and many of my colleagues. We had thrown everything we had into preparation. Advanced weapons, global surveillance, even hints to world leaders to prepare for unity. We had amassed evidence, we had pieces of their tech, even one of their dead. Yet they remained elusive, always a step ahead. And now a new wrinkle. The Cold War, our grand cover story, was crumbling. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. The images of people dancing on that concrete symbol of division should have filled me with joy, and on one level they did. But I also felt a pang of dread. The Cold War was ending. The elaborate play of East versus West that had justified so much spending, so many secret projects, was coming unraveled. How would we maintain Operation Iron Veil without it? Would the public, basking in the end of history, be prepared to confront an extraterrestrial foe with no warning? As communism collapsed and the Soviet Union disintegrated in 1991, we quietly made moves to preserve what truly mattered. We established deeper channels with the remnants of the Soviet military and their successor states to keep sharing intel on the alien threat. We began subtly shifting the narrative, nudging the focus toward new potential threats, rogue states, terrorism, anything that might validate continued high military budgets and research that could double for anti-invasion efforts. Even so, budgets for certain black projects were trimmed in the 90s as peace dividend fever struck. I found myself fighting for funding in Washington in those days, using every trick, exaggerating a new Russian threat or a Chinese super missile, to squeeze out dollars that would actually go to advanced radar or directed energy defenses for them. It was a frustrating time, trying to keep folks' eyes on a danger they couldn't even be allowed to see. Yet, looking back, the 1980s were perhaps our last best chance to sound the alarm or make a breakthrough. Reagan believed if he had had a second Cold War enemy to justify public action, ironically, the one enemy that truly existed, people might have united. But with the Soviet threat gone, the will to believe in a bigger danger faded too. As the decade closed, I felt the clock ticking faster than ever. Somewhere out in the cosmic dark, they were surely counting down as well. The 1990s arrived with a wave of optimism. The Soviet Union was gone. America stood as the lone superpower. Peace dividends and the end of history were on every pundit's lips. Operation Iron Veil persisted, but now without the convenient East-West animosity to mask its activities. I remained in government service, an aging relic carrying an unbearable secret. I watched as humanity became complacent, convinced that the worst threats were behind us. How little they knew that the greatest threat had never gone away. In those years, our strategy shifted to quiet monitoring and gentle nudges. We had to keep the world's militaries ready for something they weren't officially allowed to know existed. Under the guise of cutting-edge research or missile defense, we sustained our vigilance. There were moments I thought maybe, just maybe, the invaders had backed off. Sightings of UFOs dipped in the early 90s, or at least became less sensational. Perhaps it was wishful thinking that they'd decided to leave us be. But that hope was shattered on March 13, 1997, when thousands of people in Arizona witnessed a vast, black, triangular craft silently drifting over the Phoenix night sky. The so-called Phoenix Lights incident was impossible to fully cover up. Too many had seen it. I remember fielding panicked calls that night from local Air Force officers. "Sir, do we engage? What do we do?" We did nothing, of course. What could we do? The craft eventually disappeared into the stars. The governor made a joke of it in a press conference, even bringing out a staffer in an alien costume to laughingly arrest him, a stunt to calm the public. But those of us in the program were not laughing. That ship over Phoenix was mile wide, far larger than anything we'd seen before. It was as if the invaders were showing off, reminding us that they could appear over our cities at will and we could do nothing but gawk. After that, a deep unease settled over the insiders. Why such a flagrant display? Were they testing public reaction? Or was it a message to us, the secret keepers, that time was running out? Some of my peers began to argue that perhaps we should start a controlled disclosure, prepare people gradually. Others were vehemently against it, fearing mass panic and a breakdown of society if the full truth came out. In the end, the policy of secrecy held. We doubled down on disinformation. For every genuine sighting that leaked, we flooded the media with outrageous hoaxes and silly alien stories. If you make the truth sound ridiculous, people dismiss it on sight. That became our mantra. The 2000s brought new distractions: terrorism, economic booms and busts, the digital revolution. I retired from official duty in the late 90s, but I remained an unofficial consultant, always watching the data streams, the satellite feeds, the intelligence reports from friends still in the game. In the wake of 9/11, the government's gaze turned firmly toward earthbound threats. Internally, I worried that we were taking our eye off the ball. Sure enough, while everyone was focused on fighting shadowy terror cells, the invaders kept at their slow, methodical work. Abduction reports ticked upward again, but who would notice when headlines blared about wars in Afghanistan and Iraq? Occasionally I'd get a midnight call from a former colleague in a panic. We had a situation, a whole family missing after a bright light was reported over their farm. Or NORAD tracked 5 fast movers over Alaska, then they vanished. No, not Russian jets. The other kind. We continued to chase ghosts in the sky with ever-improving tech. Drones, new radar arrays and space telescopes came online. Yet time and again these intelligences stayed one step ahead, revealing themselves only on their terms. One somewhat positive development came quietly in 2019. The establishment of the United States Space Force. Many snickered at the idea of militarizing space in an era where no nation had weapons up there, at least none we admitted. But I and my compatriots smiled privately. At last, an official branch of the military pointed toward the stars, openly funded and staffed. Of course, the true rationale was buried, couched in terms of satellite defense and protecting against enemy spacecraft, as if China or Russia had battlecruisers up there. In reality, Space Force was the lineal descendant of all our clandestine efforts, a skeleton of a future global defense against threats from beyond. It was a small step in the right direction, but far too late and far too modest, I fear. Then something unexpected began in the late 2010s and early 2020s, the drip of disclosure. The US Navy released cockpit videos of pilots chasing tic-tac-shaped UFOs that outmaneuvered anything known. This made international news. Suddenly, mainstream scientists and politicians were talking about unidentified aerial phenomena. The stigma began to lift ever so slightly. For the first time in my life, I heard a sitting US senator openly say, "There's something in our skies we cannot explain." I like to think some of my generation quietly nudged this along, knowing what was coming. The Pentagon even admitted it had a secret program, one of Iron Veil's descendants, to study UFOs. And in 2021, the Director of National Intelligence released a report acknowledging dozens of unexplained encounters by military personnel. To the public, this was stunning. To me, it was long overdue, and still woefully understated. They were only admitting to the tip of an iceberg that went miles deep. But it was something. I find it darkly poetic that here in 2025, at the sunset of my life, the decades of subterfuge and denial are finally cracking. People are starting to ask the right questions, yet I fear it's too late for meaningful preparation. Over the years, a few of us tried to hint at the truth in fiction and media, to seed warnings in the culture, but entertainment can only do so much. When faced with the real thing, will anyone be ready? Will they believe it isn't just another movie or hoax? As I lie here, I can't ignore the signs any longer. The atmosphere feels charged, as if the air itself knows something is coming. Worldwide, there's been a recent spike in bizarre phenomena, mass bird die-offs, inexplicable ground tremors that aren't quite earthquakes, spikes in cosmic radiation with no known source. Our scientists have scrambled for answers, but a few quietly confided to me their suspicion. These are the tremors before the eruption. In my nightmares, I see it clearly. The sky filling with ships, our communications cut, our military bases struck in an instant of searing light. It's a vision I've struggled to push away since the first day I opened that Roswell file. And now I think that day is finally at hand. Just last week, an old colleague sent me a coded email, our little private way of sharing intel even in retirement. It simply read, "Scout return complete. Harvest begins." Scout return. Harvest begins. It was our terminology from Ironvale, used decades ago in wargames for an alien invasion scenario. It meant the reconnaissance phase was over and the full-scale operation is commencing. I don't know how he knew. Perhaps a detected fleet inbound, or intercepts of an alien signal confirming schedule. Maybe it was just his gut feeling aligning with mine. Either way, I've never known him to be alarmist. If he says the harvest begins, then God help us, it is beginning. Through my window, I see the sky lighting up an eerie orange. Not the soft pre-dawn glow, but something far more sinister, like an enormous silent fire beyond the horizon. I hear a rising chorus of noises, distant booms, the shriek of what might be jet engines, and an odd electrified static in the air that sets my remaining hair on end. This isn't a drill, is it? This isn't a dream. I reach with a trembling hand and pull the nasal cannula from my nose. If this is the end, I want to face it head-on, not sedated on oxygen. I push myself out of bed, wobbling on arthritic legs, and shuffle to the window. My heart pounds, whether from exertion or terror or both. Above the town, the stars are vanishing, one by one, swallowed by a growing darkness. No, not darkness. Shapes. Huge, black silhouettes sliding in front of the stars, blotting them out. In the pit of my stomach, I know they're not clouds. The invaders' ships are here. So massive and quiet, they almost blend with the night sky, save for the halo of burnt orange city glow reflecting off their undersides. A hissing burst of static suddenly erupts from the TV in my room, even though it's off. It sounds like 100 radios all tuned to dead air, yet within it, I almost think I hear a garbled voice, or many voices, whispering in a language I cannot understand. The sound sets my teeth on edge, a nausea blooming in my gut. I recognize it. Oh God, I've heard this once before. The distorted alien transmission we intercepted in 1978. It's the same cacophony that haunted my nightmares. Hearing it aloud now, I feel tears of fear spill from my eyes. Down the hallway, I glimpse nurses and orderlies rushing, their faces pale in the red emergency lighting. One nurse stops and stares out a window like the one I cling to. Her shaky voice carries down the corridor. What is that? A visitor shouts something about an explosion downtown. Someone else is sobbing. I press my palm against the cool glass and gaze upward. One of the massive shadows is passing almost directly overhead. It has to be thousands of feet across. My mind flashes back to that night in DC in 1952, the Cuban radar blip, the Phoenix lights, all those previews of this moment. My life's work was to postpone this nightmare, and here it is at last. I feel an overwhelming mix of failure and grim resolve. A deep, thrumming hum begins to vibrate through the walls. The same tone I heard in that Area 51 hangar decades ago, now amplified 1,000-fold. Windows shudder. The entire hospital building seems to tremble with it. I think of those nuclear missiles going dead, of power grids failing. They're jamming us, blanketing the world in an electromagnetic grip. The lights won't come back on. Our machines are useless. I catch a glimpse of my reflection in the window, a frail old man in a thin hospital gown, eyes wide with the terror of a little boy. In that reflection, over my shoulder, I see the nurse who had been standing in the hall. She's behind me now, but something's wrong. Her silhouette in the dim light, it's distorted, limbs too long, head cocked at an unnatural angle. My breath catches. Slowly, I turn to face her. In the gloom, the young nurse's face is partly in shadow. Her eyes, I'd thought them to be hazel, but now they glint black in the flickering light, two large shining orbs that reflect the red emergency lights. She smiles at me, but there's nothing human in it. It's far too wide, stretching her cheeks in an impossible rictus. "Sir," she says softly, and for a terrible moment her voice seems layered as if two people speak in unison, one the gentle nurse, the other a hollow, reverberating echo. "You should be in bed." A cold wave of realization surges through me. They're here. Some of them have been here all along, wearing friendly faces, waiting. My mouth goes dry as I back up against the window, my legs shaking. Outside, the sky tears open with columns of light spearing down from the colossal ships, and the town beyond erupts in panic. Faint screams, car horns blaring, distant crashes. The invasion has begun in earnest. I turn back to the nurse, or what looks like a nurse. She steps into my room slowly. In the red glow, I see her eyes definitely aren't human now, and something about the way she moves sets every instinct screaming at me to run, though there's nowhere to go. I let out a sob, part sorrow, part anger. "Please," I whisper, not even sure if I'm begging her or apologizing or both. In response, she tilts her head almost tenderly, that awful grin still etched on her face. "Hush now," the doubled voice croons. "It will be over soon." My heart is thundering. I can feel it straining, ready to burst. Perhaps it's a mercy, a quick death by one's own frail body instead of whatever fate they have planned. To the window, I cast one last glance at the world I knew. Flames now lick the night sky in the distance. One of those brilliant beams of light strikes somewhere nearby with a soundless flash and the ground rumbles. I think of my children, my grandchildren. God, what will become of them, of all of us? The nurse creature is very close now. I can't tear my eyes from the black pits of her gaze. I summon the last strength in my dying lungs and speak, voice cracking. "We tried," I say, a tear runs down my face. "We tried to stop this. I'm sorry." Behind the inhuman eyes, I wonder if there's any understanding, any mercy. But I see nothing but an eternity of darkness. As my vision starts to fade, I hear the glass of the window cracking from the pressure, the cacophony of human chaos outside, and that pervasive hum rattling the very atoms of the air. The nurse's cold hand touches my shoulder. I choke back a final sob of regret and terror. The last thing I see is the iron veil finally torn away, the truth descending from the skies, immense and merciless. And as my heart gives one final desperate flutter, I find a small grim solace that I won't have to witness what comes next. In the end, the war we feared never came from across borders. It came from beyond the stars. We spent decades building walls, launching weapons, and telling lies, all to delay the inevitable. Now that the veil has been lifted, there's only one question left. Did we ever stand a chance? The Cold War was a lie. The invasion was real. And now it's already begun.
Every story has an end, but here, the mysteries never stop. Thank you for watching and being a part of this journey into the unknown. Your support keeps these stories alive, and there's plenty more waiting for you. We drop 3 new stories every week, so if you crave suspense, the unexplained, and the downright chilling, make sure you're subscribed and ready for what's next. Until then, keep your lights on, your doors locked, and remember, some stories stay with you long after they're told.